So at the end of the last video we set up and centered the swash. The servo horns are at 90 degrees, the swash is beautifully level and the blades are exactly at 0 degrees. Now there's a danger we fall into a trap here, and as we move on to the next screen we can see the swash dances around and it finishes up slightly tilted. But don't worry, we'll correct the faults that we see in front of us now as we go through the rest of the setup. Swash plate servo directions. So what we're going to check on this page is that when we move the collective stick up and down on the transmitter, the servos on the Heli move up and down in the correct sense. If they don't, then what we're going to do is use the buttons for each of the servos, if necessary, to invert the servo direction and make sure that the swash all moves correctly. Now you can actually see that there's 4 orange dots on the page. Don't worry about the bottom one, you'll see the text associated with that is greyed out, and that only comes into play if you have a swash that has 4 servos operating it. If you did have a 4 servo swash, then you would have selected that earlier on in the Studio X setup, and then that button would be available. But as our swash on the T-Rex 500 only has 3 servos, then we don't need to worry about that. So first let's have a look and see what the swash is actually doing. At the moment the collective stick on the transmitter is at bottom stick. Not ever so easy to see in this picture, but the swash is not level, and in fact it's actually tilted towards us. If you look at the swash closely, you can see that the far servo, the left roll servo, is actually in the higher position, but that the right roll servo and the elevator are in the lower position. So I would suggest that the one that we need to alter is the one for the left roll servo, which is servo on channel 2. So if we invert the servo in Studio X for channel 2 aileron left, you can see that that lowers that servo position, and once again the swash appears to be level. And as a final check, if I move the collective stick towards the top, then all the servos should move in unison. The swash should remain level as it goes up the main shaft. And in fact you can see that is exactly what we've got. Now as I lower it from the top back down to the bottom stick, then again it all moves down symmetrically. Now we've not made any changes at all in the transmitter. The changes for this step have only been made in Studio X. So we'll move on to the next page and then I'll be back with you. So we're now on the swash plate servo throw cyclic pitch ratio page. What we're trying to do is to give the flybarless unit a datum so that it knows roughly how much cyclic pitch it's putting into controlling the Heli when it gets disturbed in flight. Now that sounds quite complicated, but really all we have to do is align the blades with the boom of the Heli in the fore and aft axis as we did before. We put on a pitch gauge and zero it. We then hit the measure button and just check that the flybarless unit in Studio X is driving the swash plate to 6 degrees, and if it's not, we just simply adjust it. So I've aligned the blades with the tail boom, I've put on the pitch gauge, and if I press the 0 button, so now the blade pitch is measured as 0. So I now press the measure button in Studio X and it drives the swash by a predetermined amount, and you can see it's about 6.1, 6.2 degrees. Now you can actually see it's minus 6.1, minus 6.2 degrees, but it doesn't matter whether it's a minus or a plus figure, it's the actual amount of deflection that's important, not whether it's positive or negative. So it's pretty close to what we want, so I'll just make a small correction in Studio X to get that as close to 6 degrees as I can. Just in case there's any sticking on the servos, I'll just reselect neutral and then reselect measure, and you can see now it's giving me about 5.7. So I'll make another small correction, reselect neutral, go back into measure, 5.9. So I'll just increase it a little bit more, go back to neutral, go back to measure, and there we have 6 degrees. So that's the swash plate servo throw cyclic pitch ratio complete. So let's move on to the next page. Collective pitch adjustment. So 4 things to do on this page. In step 1 we're checking that the swash is moving in the correct direction, and if it isn't then we'll reverse it in the transmitter. In step 2 we're checking that the flybarless unit is sensing the correct swash plate movement and that it matches that of the transmitter, and if it doesn't then we'll reverse it using the buttons at the bottom of the page. In step 3 we're checking that the endpoints in the transmitter match what is expected to be seen by the flybarless unit. And in step 4 we're setting the maximum minimum pitch physically on the helicopter to match that required by the manufacturer, and for most helis that's between 12 and 14 degrees. Okay, so let's go through those steps one at a time. So step 1, we're going to move the thrust stick up and down on the transmitter and make sure that the swash plate moves up when the stick goes up, and make sure that the swash plate moves down when the stick goes down. If it doesn't do so, then it's just simply a matter of reversing the pitch channel in the transmitter. So I'm now going to move the collective stick from the lower position to the top position on the transmitter. If the swash plate moves up, then there's nothing else to do. If you don't need to reverse the pitch channel in your transmitter, then you can move on to step 2. If however when I move the collective stick up the swash plate moves down, then obviously we need to reverse it in the transmitter. I'm moving the stick up now and you can see that the swash is operating in the reverse sense. As I lower the collective stick, the swash moves up. So we do in fact need to reverse it in the transmitter. So if you select the roller, so you can go into the function list, scroll down to servo setup, scroll down to travel, select it with the roller, select the reverse function, and then it's a matter of rolling down to the pitch channel and hit reverse. Okay, I've reversed it in the transmitter, and now as I move the collective stick up, the swash moves up, and as I move the collective stick down, the swash moves down. So it's now operating in the correct sense. Having reversed the pitch channel in the transmitter, we can now move on to step 2. So in step 2 what we're doing is checking that these labels, this one here and this one here, light up correctly and this slider moves in the correct direction in accordance with the movements on the transmitter stick. Obviously this is how the AR7210BX is sensing what the stick is doing. And if it's not correct, then it's just a matter of selecting either the normal and the inverted button at the bottom here to change it over. So if I now move the throttle or collective stick from the lower position to the top position, you'll notice on this occasion that the little spot slider goes down, and when the stick is fully at the top, the lower button here is lit up, and as I move the stick to the bottom, the slider goes in the wrong direction, and then the top button here lights up. Clearly that's the wrong way around, so if I just select the normal button just here, then you'll notice that the button at the lower position is lit up, and now as I move the stick up, the slider goes up, and when the stick gets towards the top, the upper button lights up, and as I move the stick down, the slider moves down, and as I get towards the bottom, the lower button here lights up. So now it's moving in the correct sense, and we can move on to step 3. What's important to get your head around, and it was similar when we were doing the rudder actually on the Heli earlier on, is that in step 1 we are checking for the correct direction, and if it's not right then we make changes in the transmitter, and in step 2 we're again checking for the correct direction, and if it's not right we make the changes in Studio X. And it's important to not get those two things confused. So in step 3 we're moving the travel, ATV or endpoint, depending on the terminology you prefer to use, so that the transmitter is calibrated to the flybarless unit. The way we do that is we raise the collective stick all the way to the top, and we're looking for the positive button just here to light up when we get to the top. Now that's gone green at the moment, and you could argue that it's lit up, but you'll notice that the terminology on the button has changed to increase. And the same way at the moment the negative button is white, but as I lower the stick the button goes again the greeny colour and it says increase. So if we return the collective stick to the lower position, go into the servo and travel menu in the transmitter, and it's a matter of increasing the travel endpoints one step at a time until that button goes red and it says OK. So to change the endpoint travel or ATV in the transmitter, click the roller, go into the function list, roll down to servo, click it. We've already got the travel menu selected, so roll to the right until you've selected the pitch channel. Click the roller, which will make the little square flash on the pitch channel, and then it's just a matter of increasing that pitch travel endpoint one stage at a time until the little button in Studio X lights up red. And in a similar way now, with the collective stick at the top, it's a matter of altering the endpoint for travel in the transmitter for the pitch channel, slowly increasing it one step at a time until again the button goes blue and it says OK. So if you now move the collective stick all the way to the top, you'll notice the little box around the 102 value on the pitch channel moves to the upper value, and you can just basically increase that until again the blue light just lights up on the button in Studio X and it says OK. Once that's done, then press the back button to come out of it. So that's step 3 completed. So now let's move on to step 4. So if we look in the manual for the T-Rex 500L, it recommends a maximum pitch of 11 degrees and a minimum pitch of minus 11 degrees. So next we need to check what pitch we've got on the Heli as it currently stands. So if you turn on your pitch gauge, and what I normally do is place it on top of the motor to zero it, and sometimes it takes a couple of presses of the button to get it exactly right. And you can see at the moment we've got minus 8.7 degrees, and if we go to top stick we've got plus 10.6. So before we get carried away with changing the pitch settings using Studio X, we need to make sure we've got a straight line 45-degree curve in the transmitter. If you haven't got that, then obviously that curve will affect your pitch settings. If we set up the transmitter with a new model initially with a helicopter as the flight model, then it will almost certainly have put those 45-degree lines in for the pitch curve. But let's just check. So if we click the roller, go into the function list, roll down until we get to pitch curve, click the roller, and you can see there 45 degree from the bottom left to the top right, going from 0 to 100%. So that will work, so that's good enough. So coming back to Studio X, it's just a matter of adjusting the plus and minus buttons, and that will change the values, which are currently set at 600 for negative pitch and 600 for max positive pitch. And you just alter those buttons until they give you the pitch that you desire. So in our case, plus 11 degrees, minus 11 degrees. And don't be surprised if those values are not identical. Just because we're setting plus 11 and minus 11, we could, for example, end up with two different numbers for max positive and max negative pitch. The other thing that we have to ensure that happens is before we start altering the pitch on the blades using Studio X, that we've got the blades exactly aligned on the fore-aft axis of the helicopter, parallel to the boom. The rear blade needs to be over the boom. Obviously, if the blades are not aligned correctly with the fore-aft axis of the helicopter, then it's not going to give you an accurate blade pitch. So we're starting off at around about minus 8.9, minus 9 degrees negative pitch. I'm now going to increase the value in Studio X until it gives me the 11 degrees that I'm looking for. And you can see as I'm increasing the value, the pitch on the blade is increasing until we get 11 degrees. Now the resolution in Studio X is very, very fine, and the resolution on the servo is not quite as fine. So what you'll sometimes find is if you increase the value, nothing appears to happen, then all of a sudden it'll jump to maybe from 11, say, to 11.5 degrees. So having set what we think is the correct value, I'm just going to go now to full collective pitch and back down to full negative pitch. And you can see instead of 11 it's come out at minus 10.9. And that's just a reflection of the relative resolution of Studio X software and the servos in the Heli. So it's just a matter of tweaking it a little bit more. So I'll increase it a bit more. It doesn't appear to have changed the value there, but I'll go to full collective and then negative collective, and you can see it's hovering between 10.9 and 11, so I'll go a little bit more. We'll go to max collective and back to min collective, and it appears to be at 11. I'll just try that one more time. Yeah, I'm happy that that's 11 degrees. It's just a matter now of repeating the same process for the top stick. So the positive pitch is a lot closer to what we require. We've already got a reading of 10.7 and we only require 11. So it's just a matter again of just increasing those values in Studio X using the plus and minus buttons until we get the 11 degrees that we're looking for. That looks to be about right, and in the same way again I'm just going to exercise the collective by going max negative, max positive, and in fact it's sitting there at 11 degrees. Yeah, I think I'm happy with that. And just to check the negative again, 11 degrees, maybe 11.1. So that's step 4 complete. In fact, that's the collective pitch adjustment page complete. So we can now move on to the next page. Just before we move on to the next page, I'll show you the values that we eventually ended up with. So we ended up with a value of 750 for minimum pitch and a value of 621 for max collective pitch. The values are completely arbitrary, and when you set your Heli up, you just set it up to give you plus 11 and minus 11 degrees in this case, and whatever values you end up with are the values that you end up with. Cyclic limit adjustment. This page currently has a value of 1060. Again, it's an arbitrary limit and you set whatever is required. So you can make corrections to the 1060 value. You can actually rotate the circular dial round, and that's to make large course corrections, and then when you've got the value about correct, then you can use the plus and minus buttons really to fine tune the value to give you exactly what you want. So the actual value is arbitrary, and if the value is too high, then if say you have max collective, full forward cyclic or full back cyclic as well, then there is a chance that the swash could be at its limits and may cause the servos to bind. Similarly, if that value was too low, then you just simply wouldn't have enough movement on the swash. So the way you check it is to simply select max collective. You then move the cyclic stick all the way around the extremities of the cyclic movement to make sure that the servos aren't binding excessively. You then repeat the same process for min collective, so bring the collective stick all the way to the bottom, and again just move the cyclic stick all the way around the sides of the cyclic movement. Effectively what you're doing is creating a digital cyclic ring. If we look at the swash on the Heli, then what you can see, we go to max collective and then we move the swash all the way around in a circle using the right stick or cyclic stick on the transmitter, and then repeat the process for bottom stick. And we're looking for excessive servo binding, and in particular we're checking to make sure that this long linkage ball here doesn't reach the top or the bottom of the anti-rotation bracket, which again would cause the servos to burn out. So if I just show you again, if I go to max collective, and you can see when I've gone full back on the cyclic, that's not really a problem, but as I go full forward, you can see it gets very close to the top of that anti-rotation bracket, but it doesn't actually bind. And there's plenty of clearance at the bottom end with max collective, but if I now go to min collective, try the same again, and obviously with lots of clearance at the top this time, but not so much but certainly enough at the bottom. So I think the 1060 value that's in the Studio X is actually okay on this occasion. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to set it really low so that you can see what the effect is. The minimum value you can actually set is 700. So again, moving the swash all the way around at both max and min collective, you can see it still moves okay, but it doesn't move quite as far. The maximum value you can set is 2000, and I think that might be a little bit excess. So I'm going to set 1500. So if I move the collective all the way up and now start to move the swash fully forward, you can see that that long swash ball link gets to the top of the anti-rotation bracket, and that's only with about half cyclic. If I was to leave the Heli set up like that, then when I flew it, I would probably burn out the servos after quite a few flights. So I don't recommend you try this at home, folks. So I've now returned the cyclic limit adjustment to 1060, and if we check it now, I think we'll find that again we just don't quite make the top of the anti-rotation bracket with that long ball. And if I go to min cyclic and come down to the bottom, the same is true. So that value of 1060 seems to work fine, but as I say, the value is arbitrary, and don't think because 1060 works on this helicopter with this transmitter that it's going to work on yours. You're going to have to experiment and come up with your own value. So that's the cyclic limit adjustment page complete. So now we can move on to the next page. Cyclic control directions. This is actually very similar to the collective pitch adjustment page and the rudder servo gyro adjustment page. A lot of the way the page is laid out, you'll notice the similarities. So 3 things to be done on this page, and each of those 3 things need to be done both for the aileron axis and the elevator axis. So let's have a look at them. So the first thing to do is to check that the cyclic stick on the transmitter moves the servos correctly for both the aileron and elevator function. The second thing to do is to check that the fly barless unit is detecting the correct movement of the stick, again for both the aileron and elevator. And the last thing to do is to check the travel or endpoints and check that the labels light up accordingly for both aileron and elevator. So let's go through those things one at a time. So the first thing to do is check that the swash plate is moving correctly when we move the cyclic sticks. I always find it easier to do this when looking at the back of the helicopter. So if I move the cyclic stick to the right, then the swash should move to the right. So I move the cyclic stick to the right, and you can see that the swash tilts to the left. So that is incorrect. So because the aileron channel needs to be reversed in the transmitter to ensure correct swash movement, we click the roller, go into the function list, servo setup, select travel, change it to reverse, roll down to aileron, click it, and you'll notice the little black dot moves up to the top, reversing the aileron function. If we were to click it again, it would come back down to the bottom, but we want it reversed, so we click it again to move it up to the top. Having done that, then we come back out of it. So now when I move the cyclic stick to the right, the swash moves to the right, and when I move the cyclic stick to the left, the swash moves to the left. So now we're going to check that the swash plate is moving in the correct sense for the elevator. So when I move the cyclic stick rearward, then the swash should tip rearward. And as you can see, that is correct. So on this occasion there is no requirement to reverse it in the transmitter. So when moving the cyclic stick in the transmitter for aileron, it was working in the incorrect sense. And in order to make it work correctly, then we reversed the aileron channel in the transmitter. The elevator function was working correctly, so there was no reversing required. So having now got the transmitter so it moves the swash plate in the correct sense, that completes step 1, and we can move on to step 2. So in step 1 we know that we set the transmitter up correctly so that it physically moved the swash plate in the correct sense. In step 2, what we are trying to check is that the fly-barless unit detects the correct movement of the stick, the cyclic stick, and if it is correct, then there's no further action required. But if it's incorrect, then we can use the normal or inverted buttons to make sure that it operates appropriately. So if we start with the aileron again, if I move the cyclic stick in the transmitter to the right, then you can see that the little slider moves to the right, and you can also see that the right button illuminates, so that is correct. And I would expect if I moved it to the left, the slider would go left and the left button would illuminate, so no problems there. So if I now move the cyclic stick forward, I would expect the forward light to illuminate and the slider go to the right, and you can see it's operating in the incorrect sense. If I pull the cyclic stick rearwards, then I would expect the left button to illuminate and the slider go left. So it's completely in the wrong sense. And all it is a matter of changing the button selecting here. So we'll select normal. So if we move the cyclic stick forward, I would expect the right button to illuminate and the slider go to the right, which it does. And similarly, if I pull back on the cyclic stick, then the left button will illuminate and the stick goes to the left. So that completes step 2, and we can now move on to step 3. In step 3 we're setting up the travel, endpoint, ATV, whichever terminology you wish to use, for both the aileron and the elevator function. So we'll start with the aileron once again. So if I move the aileron stick on the transmitter all the way to the left, you can see the slider moving. You can see the left button is illuminated, and when the slider and the stick is at full travel, it says increase on the button. So that is not correct. So whilst holding in full left aileron stick, I need to click the roller to get to the function list, roll down to servo setup, click servo setup, travel is already selected, and I move to the aileron function. Notice that the top box is highlighted with the little rectangular cursor. I click it to make it flash, and then it's a matter of slowly increasing the values until that increase box goes OK, and on this occasion lights up red. To set the right aileron travel, I move the cyclic stick all the way to the right. We are already in the travel menu. Notice that the box comes down to the lower value. Click the roller once again until it starts flashing, and slowly increase the travel until the button just lights up blue and it says OK. Notice that we've ended up with values of 106 and 103. Sometimes those travel values will be the same, sometimes they'll be completely different, and it's just a matter of again accepting whatever is in the transmitter. So you can now see that when I move the cyclic to the left, the left button initially says increase, but at full range just goes to OK. And when I move the cyclic all the way to the right in the transmitter, the slider goes right, the button lights up, initially says increase, and at full travel it goes blue and says OK. So that's the aileron axis set up in Studio X and with the transmitter. So now it's just a matter of repeating the process for the elevator axis. If I move the cyclic stick full forward or full aft, you can see that the buttons light up, but they don't go red and blue, and we don't get the OK light. So once again into the transmitter, click the roller into the function lift, down to servo setup. Travel is already selected. This time we are looking for elevator. Because the transmitter stick is in the centre at the moment, the box highlights both values for elevator travel. But notice as I move the stick full forward, the upper box is highlighted, and it's a matter of again of increasing the travel one click at a time until the increase light changes in Studio X and we get a blue light and it says OK. I then move the elevator stick all the way to the bottom, and again notice that the cursor box has moved down to the lower value. It's already flashing, so I can just click the roller one stage at a time until the increase light goes red and it says OK. This time now we've ended up with values of 104 and 105. So showing the same thing in Studio X, if I now move the cyclic stick full forward, you can see the slider goes right, and as the stick reaches the top, then the light changes to blue and it says OK. And if I move the stick full down, then the button changes to red and again it says OK. So at the moment I've got a value of 105 in the travel for the elevator in that position, and if I just back that off by one number from 105 to 104, you can see that the button says increase and it's no longer red, it's gone the teal colour. So when you change these numbers, it's just a matter of increasing it enough to make the button change to either red or blue and for it to say OK. So that's the third stage completed on the cyclic control direction page, and in fact that completes the cyclic control direction page in total. You'll notice in the right hand corner there's no longer a next button, there is only a previous button in the left hand corner. That's because we've completed now the basic Heli setup, and the quickest way to get back to the home page is to click the home button in the top left. Brings us back to the home page, and the Heli basic setup is complete and all the changes that we've made have been saved.